Hey friends, welcome back to my channel. This is Sare Liz, or as some know me, Mother Sare, and I've got a sermon for you today. The quality is a bit different than this intro because it was recorded during a worship service. These are audio-only recordings because that's what's manageable at this time. For more details concerning when, where, and what bits of the Bible were being preached on, look to the description below this video. I hope you enjoy the message. Here we go!
There are many things in the Old Testament and the New Testament that it seems like God and the prophets of God and all those who seem to understand God's wisdom are trying to tell people around them. It's like a society who's ready to take the next greatest step. They're ready to take a next step into being a better society, even better than they were before. And when I think about that in modern terms, I think we're like that society too, except depending on your political party, we think that step is in different directions. But that's okay, because we're just like that. We're a really good society, ready to take the next step to make us a great society. And it was the same thing for Israel. Israel, particularly compared to the ancient societies that surrounded it, was a really good society. They worshipped a God who was ethical. Now, you may think to yourself, so, aren't most gods like good, ethical? Not in ancient times. I mean, think about everything you've heard about Zeus. He had many children by many different people, and not all of them were, consensual. That would be an example of an ancient god who was not what you'd call ethical. Or he had the same sort of ethics that the people who worshipped him. The Jewish God, the Almighty, Yahweh, had a set of ethics that were higher and loftier than the people who worshipped him. And he tried to teach them the better way to be. So, we've got this ancient society. And much like us, they're a very good society. And they're ready to take the next step to become a great society. Now, this doesn't mean that they're perfect. And it doesn't mean that they have it all together. Much like America is not perfect, and it doesn't have it all together. But when we read in, say, the book of Sirach, we read a lot about the pride of sin and power dynamics and trying to figure out who we can be in terms of our neighbors. And it's all very positive stuff. It's all very, here's some wisdom. We need to learn to be kind to people. And that continues in the Psalms. We need to remember the widows. We need to remember the orphans. But one thing that they've got a big blind spot to, and the thing about blind spots, and you can see this in your own cars, everybody's got a blind spot. Not everyone's aware what their blind spot is or that there's a car in it. And hence we have lots of accidents sometimes. Well, I didn't see that car. Well, that's because you didn't turn your body around and look, and it was in your blind spot. The blind spot of ancient Israel is their enemies. They can think all they want about being good and kind to the people in the margins of their societies, who they were not often good and kind to. But they could hear that. They could hear, gosh, we need to be better about this. We need to be better toward our widows. We need to be better toward our orphans. We need to be better to the foreign refugees in our land. We need to be better to them. But don't talk to them about their enemies, because God will crush them. God will annihilate them. They will be wiped from the earth, and so will their cattle. So this is obviously a blind spot of ancient Israel. And it's an easy blind spot for most people to have. But so when we hear this ancient wisdom, and it's so forward-thinking about dealing with these people who have no place in society, and the orphans, and the widows and the refugees. And we think to ourselves, or I think to myself, gosh, we could take a page out of their book. But don't take the page out of their book that has to do with enemies, because that was their blind spot. What this has to do with the gospel is that Jesus was talking to the people who had invited him for this dinner party about their blind spot. So, it's the Sabbath. What does that mean? It's the day that no one can work, and that you have to have a lavish feast anyway. So what that means is that the women, because it's only the women, who prepare the Sabbath meal have to do it all ahead of time. And if you think that's difficult with modern conveniences, imagine doing it when you have a fire and that's it. It's tricky, but they've managed for millennia, so they've figured it out. So he's going to this Sabbath supper, which, you know, in a smaller household, in a poorer household, might just be a Sabbath supper. Just a meal. Not a big deal. But this is not a simple household. This is not a poor household. This is not the household of a fisherman. This is not the household of someone who has just a couple of goats. This is not the household of someone who is living like hand-to-mouth, week-to-week subsistence. This is the household of a Pharisee. This is the household of someone who is at the upper echelons of society. And it's not just a simple supper you've been invited to. It's not just lasagna and some hard bread and a little bit of salad. This is a feast. And so, at this banquet that is the Sabbath meal, Jesus is not the only one who's been invited. Jesus' students are not the only ones who've been invited. There's heaps of people who've been invited to have Sabbath dinner at this Pharisee's house. And I just think of that poor man's wife and maidservants. But anyway, the time was not feminist, friends. It was not remotely feminist. So he's getting there, and he's walking into this difficult situation full of manners and social rules and the subtle rules of polite behavior. And I don't know if you've realized by now, but Jesus doesn't go in for subtle rules of polite behavior. If you invite him over to a really high society banquet, you've got a coin toss on how he's going to act. He might be the most charming and interesting person at the table, just an absolute gem to have as a guest. And he might be like picking up a pretty snake and having it bite you. It really depends. And this is one of those pretty snakes that bites moments. Because when he walks in and he starts seeing people, random people, who knows, taking the places of honor. And of course, this is like this ancient custom at banquets in that region at that time, a little bit like a wedding reception, except without the name tags. So imagine the chaos of a wedding reception of, I don't know, let's say a modest one of 200. I've been to some large ones. They can get crazy. Imagine a wedding reception of 200 that's totally formal and has no name tags, and you have to guess how important you are to the bride and groom. And what's more, if you guess wrong, the bride's father will come over to you and say, terribly sorry, but could you sit way the hell back there? Thank you so much. And if you are thinking to yourself, well, I don't want to be shown up in front of like everybody who's already arrived, I'll just sit back here. Then the bride's father can say, oh, friend, come, sit at the head table. You mean so much to the bride. You know, and so you can think to yourself, ooh, I am important. I am loved. Isn't this wonderful? Everybody knows how wonderful I am. And small children call me queen. It's a beautiful thing. You know, but it's this crazy social situation, and like there are no place tags. There are no little guides and hints to say, today, you're the most important person. You get to sit next to the host. Today, Bruce, I'm so sorry. You're the least important person. You sit in the back. Like, there's no guides to that. And so Jesus tells this parable that would have been really embarrassing to the people who had just taken the places of honor. And Jesus' point in this particular situation is, just sit in the back. Just always sit in the back. And wait for someone to come and get you. Don't think so highly of yourself all the time that you embarrass yourself in front of others. So, if that weren't bad enough, if that weren't picking up the pretty snake and having it bite you enough, then he turns to his host. Now, this is the guy who's just invited him for what is promised to be a beautiful Sabbath feast. And he says, and you go inviting fancy people so that it can sparkle and shine at your gatherings. You go inviting important people so they'll return the invitation and you can see inside their beautiful houses so you can feel important and loved. You go inviting all your friends because it's so wonderful to have them around you. And now we're getting into territory that to me seems like, okay, what's so bad about that? You go inviting all these people that make you feel comfortable. You and your wealth and your glamour. And you get something really big out of it. Jesus says, don't do that. Now, point of fact, Jesus has just been invited to this banquet. And Jesus says, invite the people who can't possibly repay you. Invite the people with terrible manners. Invite the people who can't be invited anywhere and who could never have this kind of feast. Invite them with no hope of thanks. Invite the people who will never send a thank you note afterwards. Invite them because then you'll get all your reward, not here on earth, but in heaven. What Jesus is trying to do in this, let us call it a teaching moment, in the midst of this fancy banquet he's been invited to, which apparently is the sort of thing he does on a regular basis. He's trying to get them to think and act and be outside of what they always assume is the good and right thing to do. He's trying to get them to be genuine about all of those laws that the nation of Israel, holds in theory, to, in theory, welcome and love the widow and the orphan and the outsider and the foreigner in your land. In theory, take care of the poor in a variety of ways. And that's all fine in theory, but Jesus wants to know what you do at your dinner parties. Are you doing it at your dinner parties? And I don't know about you, but I don't always do that at my dinner parties. Not that I've had one in a while. But it doesn't always happen at the dinner parties I go to either. But Jesus' point isn't really about dinner parties. Jesus' point is really, what do you do with your time and your energy? Do you just keep doing the same things you've always done? Do you just keep doing the same things that everyone around you does? Or are you trying, in whatever way makes sense to you, to love your neighbor no matter who your neighbor is? That's a tricky one. That's a tricky one. And last summer, I had my own come to Jesus moment at a banquet. And I was totally shown up. I did not do it initially. And then I realized oh, is that what God wants me to do? Well, sure, okay, we can do it that way. And my family helped me to throw a big birthday party for me because I turned 40. And in our family, when one turns 40, there's a bit of a celebration. Often there's a bounce house. Because, you know, the kids that are associated with us really enjoy it, and when the kids are done, the adults really enjoy it. And so there was a bounce house in our crazy backyard that is not yet finished and that looks a bit of a jungle right now. And there was a grill and friends and family and all sorts of people. And in our neighborhood, we live on the west side of Buffalo. It is a multi-ethnic neighborhood. I'm going to guess 8 to 10 languages are spoken on the streets. And there are hordes of little children of a variety of different ethnicities, and most of them play together. And these hordes of little children are all somewhere between about 5 and 12. And so they're all about the same height, and they all look about the same, and they all dress about the same. Most of them are boys. And most of the time, they're just playing and happy. And we can hear them late into the night. It's kind of comforting. You're like, oh, in our neighborhood, there aren't gunshots. There's the sound of children playing. How delightful. So the children noticed the bounce house, and they noticed that they weren't invited. So we have a really long driveway. This is one of the sections of Buffalo where the houses are super thin and super long. And so you've got this super thin, long house, and then you've got a very long driveway. It's a single-car driveway. And then right next to the driveway is the next house, super thin and long, super long driveway, next house. And so we're all jam-packed in here. And we've got this much of a front yard and a backyard that keeps going. So after a while, there are maybe 20 or 30 people in my backyard of varying ages. And the grill's going, and I'm turning raw hamburger patties into hockey pucks, as you do. And I got a lot of flack for that one. And halfway up the driveway, and we had parked the cars somewhere else so that you could see clearly, we had a little sort of barricade because we have a very small pool set up, and you got to barricade it from the children if you don't have a fence. And slowly, in ones and twos and threes, a horde of little children crept up the driveway, just kind of, hopefully. And they stopped at the barricade, which happened to be 2 sawhorses with some stuff laying against them, old doors, and leaned against the sawhorses, and had big puppy eyes, all of them, all of the children. And once 1 or 2 children were leaning up against the barricade, 3 or 4 more came and kind of looked behind them like, gosh, is that a bounce house? Golly, you only have 2 children in that bounce house. Well, we really like bounce houses. And I'm seeing this out of the corner of my eye, and I'm trying to play hostess. And I'm trying to man the grill, and I really should have fobbed that off on somebody else, because I really can't play hostess and man the grill at the same time. And this was before my husband had grown his mad grilling skills. He's pretty good now. And I'm trying to be a hostess, and I'm trying to man the grill, and my sister Rose, who's not here, so I can use her blithely in a sermon, says, "You're going to do something about those kids?" I'm like, "What do you want me to do? I'm not going to shoo them away like flies." And I'm going on, and then there are more children leaning, hopefully, with their eyes wide, looking between the grill and the table overflowing with food, because it was a bit of a potluck, and the pool, and the bounce house. And so my sister comes up and says, "You really should invite them in and let them use the bounce house." And I think to myself, I have just divested myself of running a summer camp for kindergartners. I am really happy no longer being the professional, responsible adult. I don't have any children. I don't want any children. My nieces and nephews are all college age or better. I'm done with looking after small children. And then I think to myself, essentially, what would Jesus do? And Jesus would have issued an invitation to the general populace before the party began. And so I invite them in. And there's a general stampede to the bounce house. And then the adults start taking turns really looking after the bounce house, because two small, really small children can hardly bump into each other in the bounce house. But 9 or 10 children of various sizes can totally ram into each other in the bounce house, and they can be a little dangerous. So we kept a circular watch, and there was a point in time where things were getting a little too rambunctious, and I put on my responsible adult hat and got everybody out of the bounce house because it was time for the bounce house to rest. I just make these things up naturally. And then they're looking at the grill like this. I'm like, okay, who's Muslim? You. You can't have the hot dogs or this or this or this. Is anyone Jewish? Okay, no one's Jewish. Does anyone else have an allergy? Are you allergic to something you're not allowed to eat at home? Okay, so we sort that all out. I'm like, what do you want from the grill? And so we take the orders from the grill. But some of these kids are still pretty small. And even the 12-year-olds are having trouble navigating, how do I get the macaroni salad from the bowl to my plate? This is confusing. So then we take turns filling up all of the dishes, all the plates for the children so that they can have a place. And then it starts to rain. And, the saga continues. But it doesn't really bother us. Everybody crowds under the one little tiny tent we had put up over the food, just to keep it shaded. And then everyone's crowding in with the children. And there isn't a whole lot of conversation because the children are really focused on the food. And some of the children don't have great English skills. But there was a brief moment of unity in our neighborhood. And I am ashamed to say it's not because I initiated it. It's because we put up a bounce house in the back, and because it has the allure of the bounce house, and it calls children in from all over. If they can just see the little inflated turrets, they're coming, they're coming. And that was a moment that made me realize that there was more I could do if I ever had something like that again. And yes, we could talk about insurance. We could talk about liability. But, pardon me, I have to sneeze. But the greater issue, I think, no, apparently I don't have to sneeze. I apologize. The greater issue here is that I made a bunch of assumptions. It's a private party, first of all. It's my 30th birthday party. It's Michael's 40th. I just lost a decade. It's my 40th birthday party. It's Michael's 33rd birthday party. It's our family and friends. Why would we invite strangers? That doesn't make sense. And yet, at some point in the party, it did make sense. It did make sense to invite the strangers. And there was more than enough food. We had heaps of food. We could have fed, as one of my friends likes to say, half of the Chinese army. There was plenty of food. And there was plenty of bounce house. And there was plenty of space in our little backyard. This was a moment where all of my assumptions about what would be appropriate and good and proper and the best thing to do were completely thrown out the window. And all the neighborhood children learned my name. And I'm not saying that you have to go rent a bounce house and invite all the neighborhood children. But you can be open when God gives you a little nudge in the middle of you making assumptions. Because I made a bunch of assumptions. And God gave me a little nudge. Actually, God gave me kind of a big nudge because my sisters are not small nudges. God gave me some big nudges, and I finally responded. And then something beautiful happened in our neighborhood. And for a very brief time, the world was a better place in Buffalo. At least according to those children. That is what God is trying to do for us all the time. And it's not just about bounce houses. And it's not just about children. It's about everyone, everywhere. And it's you and I that need to be open to responding. Amen.
Hey friends, thanks for listening. Sometimes a sermon can lift us up, and sometimes it can leave us thinking. And sometimes we can walk away seriously challenged. This is totally normal, and you're not alone. We're supposed to be comforted and challenged by God in turns. And today may be your turn. See you next time.